Assalamu alaikum again. Welcome to the Muslim Wellness Foundation, Omar ibn Said Institute Open House. My name is Dr. Kameelah Mu'Min Oseguera, and I am the founding executive director of Muslim Wellness Foundation and also of the chair of the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, which is also an initiative of Muslim Wellness Foundation, which began in 2015. And so what is important to share in this moment is that what I will present to you is the culmination thus far of efforts that we have engaged in since 2021. So we launched the Said Institute in 21, and at the height of the pandemic, and so it has been almost 3 years of really thinking through what does it mean for us to understand who Omar ibn Said is. What does it mean for us to think about this connection to wellness, and what it requires of us in order to really think about the ways that we continue to nurture, right, our communities on both sides of the Atlantic. So I want to play a small clip, and this is from the summer of 2022 when we, just shy of a year, began to embark on what it meant for us to think about what we understood about Omar ibn Said, and I'll share a little bit more about him, but what we understood about Omar in the United States and how we could extend that narrative beyond sort of some of the more common knowledge that we have been able to access thus far. My name is Dr. Kameelah Mu'Min Rashad, and I am the founder and president of Muslim Wellness Foundation. And Muslim Wellness Foundation established the Omar ibn Said Institute for Black Muslim Studies and Research on Juneteenth of 2021. So the exploration of Omar ibn Said's life before enslavement means that we now get to decenter white Christian American-centric narratives about who we are. Those narratives tend to be very dehumanizing, acontextual, ahistorical. It tends to be a projection of attitudes about Black inferiority on who we are. And so when we shift and we say, instead of starting in 1807 with his capture, we start with his birth, right? We start in the place that he called home, and we honor who he is by inviting all of the threads that we have been able to find evidence for, to say this was a man who can no longer be simply called an enslaved African Muslim, right? He is a community member. He is someone whose descendants now want to bring him back. And it's really exciting to be a part of a project that shifts the narratives in such fundamental ways and says to everyone, not just the American people, but it says to the global community, we are more than what you have been taught to believe we are, right? We are scholars, we are family members. We are also people who are longing to know ourselves in a very deep and rich and captivating way, and we're inviting you to witness that journey with us. So, alhamdulillah, I hope that provided just a little bit of what I certainly feel in terms of excitement of, why we're exploring not just who he was, but what he means for us in terms of thinking about American Muslim well-being. Muslim Wellness Foundation is built on these sort of this approach to healing. This is how we consider what must be presented, the conversations that we must have about, again, not just what it means to address individual mental health challenges, but thinking about the impact of Islamophobia, of anti-Blackness, of Christian hegemony, of white supremacy on American Muslim communities,
and how we have also thrived despite, right, those systems of oppression. But for us here at Muslim Wellness Foundation, it's really thinking about first recognizing what those social toxins are, meaning white supremacy, oppression, Christian hegemony. How is it showing up in our lives? Can we name it, right? Can we understand that these forces act on us on multiple levels? And so this recognition is important. And for the Omar ibn Said Institute, as recognizing the conditions in which Omar would have found himself as a 37-year-old man who was kidnapped from his home and enslaved in first Charleston, South Carolina, and then in North Carolina, Fayetteville. And so how do we recognize, right? Even the context, so many hundreds of years later, is still impacting our sense of well-being, our sense of belonging, and also our sense of self. So that second sort of stage of this framework is thinking about the reflecting, right? Pondering, considering how it has wounded us, what we have done in response to injustice and to oppression. What are those aspects of our lives that we still need to sort of sit with, because they represent some manifestation of what Frantz Fanon called imperial rot, right? What we take in, what we ingest, and how that influences the ways that we think about ourselves, right? So that self-hatred, that internalized inferiority, we really want to deeply reflect on what it means for our health, right? And for our future when we have still sort of that stain and that rot inside of us. And on the other hand, we have faith, we have a sense of connectedness to who we are and to our histories that enable us, right, to detoxify, right, to purify what is sort of living within us. And then the third is to resist. And I know this word is used quite frequently, but the way that we use it here is to think about how do we cultivate strategies, right, to counteract the narratives that I mentioned in that video, that are so ubiquitous, that are present, right, in whether it's in media, it's in education, it's in law, but those narratives that again reinforce the idea that we are inherently inferior or deficient or defective because of who we are racially, religiously, or some other aspect of our identities. But throughout it all, right, we want to be able to lift up what it means for us to rejoice, to laugh, to love, to play, to think about those spiritual practices which nourish us and bring a smile to our faces. So we think about, right, how do we thrive into the future, rooted in our identities and our values and our culture, and in what and with whom do we rejoice, right? And so who are the people, the places, the ancestors, the memories that also fortify us in the midst of what we are experiencing, both in the past and presently. And so with this sort of healing framework, we think about the importance of, again, looking to our American history for examples of Muslims who have endured, right? Who have, and in the case of Omar ibn Said, who's written about his life and the clues that it leaves for us in being able to think about what does it mean to exist as someone who experiences, and in the case of Omar ibn Said, enslavement, right? And well into his 90s, and still retain that core of faith, of identity, of selfhood, right? Of personhood. And so he is one of the most beautiful examples of what it means to stay rooted in who you are. And his life provides so many lessons, so much wisdom for us in being able to think about our present circumstances. And so this is how we begin to think about what would it mean for us to draw on, again, an American Muslim, right, who was captured, kidnapped at the age of 37 in 1807 and lived the rest of his life in bondage, right, um, in the United States, right? So he was born 1770, he died in about 1864. And by all accounts, and there's so many new readings of his autobiography, which is now held by the United States Library of Congress, but there's so much. I mean, it's like beautifully overwhelming to think about what he has left for us in consideration of what it means to resist quietly, right? To understand perhaps his own suffering and longing for his family, for his country. And he is one that we still marvel about, given the many, many decades he spent in bondage, um, and held on to his identity as a Muslim and as an African. So on Juneteenth of 2021, we established the Omar ibn Said Institute, the first of its kind in the United States. And it really was a culmination of thinking through how over a decade of service to American Muslim communities, we had from the very beginning wanted to explore, again, not just what are some of the common mental health challenges facing our communities like anxiety and depression, but also what does it mean to understand ourselves in context, right? And so this work started with the Black Muslim Psychology Conference in 2015, establishing the Imam Roundtable and the Deeply Rooted Emerging Leaders Fellowship for young adults. But really, it was our commitment to thinking, again, very carefully about how do we understand the narratives of American Muslims that can help inform us of what it means to define resilience, to define wisdom, right? What gives hope and healing. And as here at Muslim Wellness Foundation, it was drawing on the history of enslaved Africans here in the United States, about a third of whom many scholars estimate were Muslim. Again, providing, looking to our American history to understand what it means to be well, what it means to hold on to those aspects of yourself that are so contested and intentionally erased. And so Muslim Wellness Foundation is a nonprofit organization that facilitates space and conversations for all American Muslims. And we have, from the very beginning, wanted to also ground ourselves in what becomes essential knowledge for us rooted in the Black experience in this country. And I think that is an important detail that is often either misunderstood or overlooked, but that it really is incumbent on us to think about, how do we live as American Muslims, right? Well, let's think about the Muslims who have come before us, right? Not just in the last couple of decades, but hundreds of years, right? What was essential? What clues did they leave us for how to live life, right, in this country under these conditions, and still maintain oneself, right, and one's connection to the Creator? So the Said Institute, the focus areas include thinking about art, culture, and activism, what it means to provide spaces for emerging adults, because our work is intergenerational, it is rooted in community, it is justice oriented, and we are very clear that our work is greatly compromised if we are not considering the needs of a next generation, and not just considering those needs, but asking them, right? Offering what we have so that they can fulfill their potentials and then in turn be of service to the community. Of course, we also think about religious leadership and development, and it is out of this focus area that we considered what it means to provide space for imams, for chaplains, for spiritual caregivers. How do we connect those in the community who may need support, right, for their psychological well-being with leaders who are not only equipped, right, to understand the nuance of those concerns, but also are supported themselves, right? That are invited into conversations that think really critically about how do we care for leaders, right? How do we make space for them to do what it is that they can do most effectively and also receive the support that they need as a community member as well. And lastly, of course, health and healing is a hallmark, of course, of Muslim Wellness Foundation. But here we're thinking about, again, health holistically, healing holistically, thinking about what is the process of reclaiming aspects of one's identity so that there's a feeling of wholeness. And so the Omar ibn Said Institute and our work in both the United States and in Senegal has provided some really rich learning areas for us to begin to think about what does it mean to learn to speak the language that Omar ibn Said spoke, right? What does it mean to think about translating his autobiography from the Arabic, but into Pular, the language that he spoke? And so it's these sort of initiatives that have been so incredibly exciting in the last 3 years. So this provides an overview of what we have begun to expand on and really think through over the last almost 15 years of work at Muslim Wellness Foundation. And I'm going to share a little bit more about each one. So the Imam Roundtable began in 2017 as a space that was cultivated within the Black Muslim Psychology Conference and has since expanded into what we conducted last year was a full sort of meeting of imams across the country. And this was about 14 or 15 imams that were engaging with us in monthly dialogues and interviews with questions around, again, their own sense of care, how they are cared for, right, as leaders, what impacts their own health and well-being, the resources and the supports that they need in order to serve well, and conversations that might be difficult to have because if you are in these roles, there is an expectation that can be incredibly exhausting, that can also require shifting of personal boundaries that is not always healthy. And so we were just really, again, overwhelmed with the willingness of these leaders. And here you see Imam Idris Abdul Zahir from Philadelphia to talk about, right, what does it mean to be vulnerable about sort of one's own needs and concerns and strengths and growth areas as a leader. And the question always is, how does the community care for its leader? How does the leader care for the community? So that this is a reciprocal relationship, not transactional, extractive, exhausting, but that actually can be very healthy, right, for everyone involved. This is a picture from actually BMPC, Black Muslim Psychology Conference last July, and our theme was joy. So thinking about all of the ways that we understand joy and warmth and laughter, and again, joy not as sort of one event, right, or just an emotion, but how do we stay connected to that feeling or that experience, particularly when we are, again, so overwhelmed by our own personal sort of challenges, but also the context, right? What is current events? What's happening now? What are those factors in our communities that deeply impact us as well? So you see here, we had a comedian. We had two, actually, Moses the comic and Nadira Pierre. We had artists like Maimouna Youssef and Asia Graydon Dantzler, the Village Auntie, Angelica Lindsay Ali, and a therapist, Nadira Habibullah, who's going to be joining us for the Intro to Black Muslim Psychology Masterclass on Monday, and Zainab Jackson, who is also a therapist. And so what I think is exciting for me, even as an organizer of this event, is that it has always included an interdisciplinary focus. So it's not just therapists talking about psychology and mental health, but is what do we learn from inviting in other experts, or not experts, right? What we call community scholars, people who have been engaged in this work for a very long time and are able to help us sort of get a sense of what our community needs and strengths. We have always had artists as a part, as facilitators of these conversations, whether it's through poetry, song, being a comedian, but really how can we understand all of these different facets of what joy is and how it's experienced and how it's can become a practice. We need as many voices in this conversation as possible. And this was a particularly memorable gathering because we had not gathered in person since 2019. So after 4 years, we did decide to resume an in-person conference, and it was extraordinary, if I could say so myself, because there was such a feeling of really of reunion, right? Of coming together, of thinking through how many of us had lost loved ones, livelihoods, right? There was so much loss and grief that was experienced through the pandemic and even till now. And so having an opportunity to come together and to talk about what joy is, right? On the face of it might seem kind of a bit of a oxymoron, like how do you experience joy in the midst of so much suffering? But again, the lessons of our ancestors tell us that this is critical. It's not something that we do when we have time, right? But we must make time to be together, to laugh, to love, and to figure out what nourishes us through everything that we experienced. Another project of the Omar ibn Said Institute is called Exploring Black Christian Views of American Muslims. And this is a collaboration with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which also began actually the same month. It began March 2020. And it was our effort to think about, again, both the composition of the Black and African American community, the significant numbers of American Muslims who also identify as Black and African American, but trying to understand, again, what are the ways that a racially minoritized community, right, of African Americans might also hold Islamophobic views, biases, attitudes. And so what does it mean to have religious privilege alongside being a racial minority, right? And having many relatives and loved ones who are also Muslim, right? And Black. And so this was a really powerful and eye-opening qualitative study that sought, right, the insight and the perspective of Black Christians in regards to their attitudes about American Muslims. And some of the key takeaways from this work was really thinking about how we repair connections within communities and within families that are damaged to some degree because of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, and religious privilege, right? What does it mean for those who are Black Christians to see themselves as sincere allies of not just Black Muslims, but American Muslims? And so this work has been incredibly profound and supported by the Pew Research Center. And at this phase, we're on track to offer this conversation along with our findings. The goal is to about 500 Black Christians across the country, that especially in this moment of heightened Islamophobia, of thinking through the impact of Zionism, of accusations of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, like what does it mean for us as not just Black and African American Muslims, but for American Muslims, right, and the whole of the community, to have conversations with Black Christians, many of whom are who are allies. But again, there's that what we internalize about ourselves due to white supremacy, and Islamophobia is a part of that. So building connections with those communities that can be natural allies, but it still needs to be sort of looked at critically and honestly and vulnerably when it comes to those potential obstacles, right, to our truly standing with one another. So I want to pause here and say, if there are any questions that you might have, feel free to add them in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer and to share as much as I can. And I'm really excited to again kind of demonstrate what this work how it has unfolded over the last 3 years. So who is Omar? We have a really fantastic conversation scheduled on Sunday at 11 a.m. Central Time with Dr. Mu'Min Oseguera, and he is an associate professor at Sheikh Diop University in Dakar. He is one of the preeminent Said scholars in the world, not just in the United States or in Senegal. And so he will be able to provide a much fuller and richer sort of synopsis of who he is and the current scholarship. But I wanted to provide this timeline as it sort of anchors us in where we are now. So just very briefly, Omar was born in Fouta Toro in Senegal. In his autobiography, he says, between the two rivers in 1770. So this is before the founding of America. He is born in West Africa, in Fouta Toro, Senegal. When he was 5 years old, his father is killed. His family moves to be with his paternal uncle. And what his autobiography shares with us is that he engaged in very deep study of the Islamic sciences. He was considered a scholar by the age of about 30. And he is captured, right, in 1807 at the age of 37. So when I think about his age and the number of years, like 2.5 decades he had spent in study, and again, in service of the community, it is almost unimaginable what he might have felt, how he made sense, right, of this completely unexpected turn of events. And so he is, although in 1808, there is a law prohibiting, what says prohibiting the importation of slaves. And it sounds, even to say that, it sounds so painful, right? That there's now this act prohibiting, right, the kidnapping, but it didn't stop the transatlantic slave trade at all. So he arrives in Charleston, South Carolina. He eventually escapes from his enslaver in Charleston, and he flees on foot from Charleston, South Carolina, to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and he is eventually purchased, right? And so I again can't help but say, like, to even utter those words, right? That there is a man who is free, who is taken from his home, and then he is purchased. Again, unimaginable, right? But as a Muslim, it is thinking through what helped him, right, through these sort of incomprehensible circumstances, to run away and then to be captured again, and then to be purchased by the person, the man John Owens, who becomes the future governor of North Carolina. So again, an extended timeline here, but I want to point out that he is writing, right? One of the reasons that he comes to the attention of these white enslavers is that they understand that he is literate, He is writing in Arabic. They can't read his writing. And so they're trying to figure out, well, who is this person? And in some newspaper headlines, they say, well, maybe he's a prince of Arabia, because they couldn't imagine that an African man would be so literate, so educated, and Muslim. And so they start to invent stories about his background and about his history that attempt to decouple, right, his Africanness from his Muslimness. But it's important here to note that is in 1831 that there's Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia, which is a turning point, right, in terms of the rise of resistance, of rebellion, of enslaved people, and then also the response, the legal response, right, the political response, the cultural and social response to that rebellion. And it is of more repression of enslaved people. So he continues to write over his lifetime, but it is around this time that of Nat Turner's Rebellion that he's writing his autobiography, what becomes known as sort of a collection of papers. And you see here, unfortunately, about 30 plus years later, a year before emancipation, he dies, still enslaved. And this autobiography is now held at the United States Library of Congress, and it was sort of lost. So the war ends, Civil War ends in 1865, and it's in 1925, right, almost, 60 years later, that there are some manuscripts that start to emerge, right? In 1991, Masjid Omar ibn Said is dedicated in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And it is important to note here that it is Black Muslims, it is African-American Muslims that are throughout time preserving the history of Omar ibn Said. He was a figure that I learned about in my childhood. Before it was sort of more popularly known, like his story, it was one that was shared to me as a child. And that personal connection being that the year that Omar was enslaved in 1807 was the same year that my fourth great grandfather, Ned Knight, was born in North Carolina. And so perhaps that was one reason that, my mother saw that connection to Omar ibn Said, because of her maternal roots in North Carolina that went back as far as the year Omar was captured. But one thing that I think that American Muslims should be very proud of is that we have fought very hard to preserve his story, despite, many anecdotes that would say he converted to Christianity, he was no longer a Muslim. Now, emerging scholarship says, again, these were all narratives that were promoted by white enslavers, by those who were advocating for in Back to Africa movements and the Colonization Society after the end of the Civil War, to say, well, it's a good thing that these Black folks were in bondage. We Christianized them, we saved them. And here, Omar is an example of our incredible work. But we know this now to be false, of course. So in 1996, it is an artist and historian, Joshua Tariq Beard, who purchases Omar's manuscripts. And Joshua Beard is a Muslim. He is a Black Muslim. And he said that his priority in his writings and his interviews, he said, my first priority is to identify Omar as a person, who his family was, where precisely he grew up. And he traveled to Senegal in 1998 in an attempt to trace his origins. And he said he came back with a number of clues. And I think this timeline is important because it shows, again, how diligently the community worked to understand who Omar is, his relevance for us today, the ways that he resisted, right, his condition of bondage, and what does it mean for us to now In this day and age, right, to think about anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, oppression, what can we learn from Omar? So it's in 2019 that the United States Library of Congress acquires the collection, which included 42 original documents in English and Arabic, including his autobiography. And then just 2 years later, in 2021, we established the Omar ibn Said Institute for Black Muslim Studies. So this is a snippet from his autobiography, in which he says, before I came to the Christian country, my religion was the religion of Muhammad, the apostle of God. May God have mercy upon him and give him peace. I walked to the mosque before daybreak, washed my face and head and hands and feet. I prayed at noon. I prayed in the afternoon. I prayed at sunset. I prayed in the evening. So this is all the ways that he's saying, I am a Muslim. I gave alms every year, gold, silver, seeds, cattle, sheep, goats, rice, wheat, and barley. I gave tithes of all of the above named things. I went every year to the holy war against the infidels. And there's some question about the interpretation, the English interpretation of this text. But he goes on to say, I went on pilgrimage to Mecca, as all did who were able. My father had 6 sons and 5 daughters, and my mother had 3 sons and 1 daughter. When I left my country, I was 37 years old. I have been in the country of the Christians 24 years. And so in this writing, we see him giving a description of what his life is like. And it is not until the last few years that we have come to different sort of interpretations and translations of his autobiography, again, which provide evidence for the fact that his identity as a Muslim remained intact. Yet, this portrait of him from 1850, so he is about 87 years old, if I'm doing the math correctly. No, he's 80 years old in this portrait. And it's inscribed, the writing at the bottom says, Christian, the highest style of man. So again, there's an effort, right, to transform him into something else, and he holds on to his identity. So from the perspective of white American Christians, who is Omar, right? And this is all taken from headlines at the time. He is a Prince of Arabia. He is an aristocrat. He's a nobleman. He was from a fairly well-established, learned, wealthy family in Futa. But this Prince of Arabia, again, is meant to sort of decouple his Muslimness from his Africanness. He becomes a, quote, rescued savage. He's a devout Christian. He's an ex-Mohammedan. He is a, quote, beloved Uncle Moro, they call him, in sort of the image of the wise and gentle elder, with bouncing a white child on his knee. And so this is what the white American Christians sort of create, the fantastical narratives that they create around who he is. And the question we had was like, well, who is Omar for African-American Muslims in particular, right? What do we learn from his life story, from his writing? Is that he potentially, right, represents an African-American Muslim ancestor of our own, right? If 30% of those enslaved were Muslim, right, according to most scholars, then what is the possibility, right? What is the connection that we may draw between who he is and what he represents in our own histories? That in his own way, he is a freedom fighter. He is writing about what it meant for him to be a Muslim. Many of his writings begin with Bismillah. And so we think about him as this patiently persevering servant of Allah, right? Someone who we can only imagine what it meant for him to accept this fate, right? Not accept it in terms of resignation, but how do I hold on to who I am at almost 40 years old, right? And to be captured, right? And then imprisoned and taken across the Atlantic and arrive to Charleston, South Carolina, he says, to a mean and cruel master. So in my eyes, and certainly the way that it was his story was presented to me as a child, he is a hero. He is an American Muslim hero. And he teaches us every day, what does it mean to persist? Right? What does it mean to call on Allah when this is what we are experiencing on the earth, right? Unimaginable circumstances, right? And we're seeing that now in terms of the pleas of the people of Gaza, right? But also their faith, right? And we think, how can you hear bombs drop every day and lose your loved ones and still call on Allah, right? We have examples in our history of how this is possible and why it is so important that we do so. So in July of 2021, I wrote a bit about, in one of Omar's writings, he says, I wish to be seen, right? That he wanted, his longing was to be back home. And at some point in his writing, we understand that it's not possible, right? There's so many theories about what it meant for enslavers to offer him something that might look like freedom if he promised to go back to his country and Christianize, right, his people. And by all accounts, he refused to do that. And so in his life circumstances, right? How do I understand my own family history? How do we understand what Black Islam is in America? How do we understand American Muslim history? And it begins by honoring who he is for us today and the lessons that we can continue to learn. And so our work with Omar ibn Said Institute and the areas that we focus on bring us to, right, not just the ways that we explore his life and legacy in the United States, but again, beginning to offer a different kind of narrative, right, for descendant of enslaved people, for Muslims. Our story does not begin with bondage. Our story does not begin with oppression, right? Our story begins with who and what are the places we call home. And so we entered into a really beautiful partnership with Dr. Mamram Sek in Dakar, Senegal, because he was also pondering this question of, well, what can we learn about his life before enslavement, right? What sort of clues and wisdom and insight does that also hold, so we can begin to understand how he could be the patiently persevering servant of Allah in this country. We have to understand the foundation that was provided for him, how he was taught, how he was educated, what was his community like back in Senegal that enabled that kind of resilience. And so we are thinking, right, more again globally, what does healing now look like, not in just a very hyper local way or even state national, but what does it mean for American Muslims to begin to expand our narrative in an international way, in a Pan-African way that allows us to draw, right, more complete stories about who we are, that is not sort of constrained to, well, these are when the enslaved people arrived, right? We were people before that, right? So how do we understand also who our ancestors are and the models and the examples that they set for us that we can draw from today? So this exploration of the influence of Omar ibn Said really thinks about these three areas of remembrance, right? Of reconnection and of reclamation. So understanding what does his life and writing mean, right, to us as descendants of enslaved people, as African descendant people, as Americans, as Muslims, as American Muslims. This is the history that belongs to all of us, right? And so much we can learn from. Reconnecting, right? So remembering who he is, reconnecting, right, with we call the land of the Christians. So lifting up the Black Muslims who preserved his legacy over these many, many decades, and then extending that, again, extending this really beautiful portrait of who Omar is back to Senegal. So expanding that and then looking at the future, right? What can we now build into the future based on our critical analysis and appreciation of the past and the present? So our work in Senegal really began in these sort of 4 stages. And the background was a really beautiful piece that was written by the Post and Courier of Charleston that also wanted to examine his life, this return to Futa, finding Omar, and then strengthening the ties here. So this first piece, I Am Omar, a quest for the true identity of Omar ibn Said, a Muslim man enslaved in the Carolinas. Jennifer Halls and Gavin McIntyre there's a beautiful link, and I can provide it, of their initial trip to this region. Again, right around the time, about a year after COVID, they visited West Africa and Senegal and really began to try to find clues. And two scholars on that trip, Dr. Mamram Sek and Abdoulaye Gay, who's a certified translator, were with these American reporters, but also wanting to explore more deeply. So Dr. Sek told us we have to go back to Futa, right? We have to go back to this place, understanding Said's clues from his own autobiography when he says, I'm from the land between the 2 rivers, right? It's like, well, what rivers is he talking about? What are the people there willing to share with us, right? What do they know of Omar? And so in a very simple yet brilliant sort of hypothesis, Dr. Sek says, well, if Omar is from this region and he's Futanke, he's from the Pular people, we have to have them translate his writing, right? And this is like, of course, it seems like, well, of course, the people where he's from should do the translation of his writing, but this had never been done before. And what emerged from their reading, and Dr. Sek is a very meticulous, extraordinary researcher. He specializes in linguistics. And what he was able to discover due to the ways that he built relationships with the village of Coppe in particular, how methodical he was, his level of patience and sincerity, just really has become known in the region as someone that they can trust, someone that they are honest with, and they call him professor, they love professor. And so they were really eager to learn more about Omar. Many of them, if not all of them, did not know that this was a man who had been enslaved from their village, who had been enslaved. And so the first time they saw his portraits, right, Omar had 3 portraits done. The first time they saw his portrait and read his writing, they said, he is one of us, right? And we'll tell you why. So this was a really beautiful discovery. And here you see Dr. Mamran Sek on the right with the chief of the village, Chief Abdullah, who has been an incredible, really the entire village has reclaimed Omar. The young people call themselves the youth of Omar ibn Said. And there is such overwhelming enthusiasm and love and appreciation for the fact that in many ways, their ancestor has returned to them through his writing. So in this next phase, we wanted to gather as much information as we could from the original documents, his manuscripts at the United States Library of Congress. And here you see Dr. Sek, who was here in the summer of 2022, doing this research, and we supported him in this, again, a fresh sort of exploration of his writing and of his papers, given the information that had been provided to him by the people of the village of Coppe. And really, when I was sort of sitting looking at Omar's manuscript, it was like an indescribable feeling, right? To see the words that had been written, right? Gosh, almost 200 years ago by an enslaved African Muslim, a scholar, still calling on Allah, right? I mean, it still to this day gives me chills. But just to be able to see that those original documents is just indescribable. And this picture sort of captures a moment where Dr. Sek is also feeling like, this is tremendous, right? This is just a moment where we have to pause and just appreciate how profound it is that this man wrote about his life, that he was drawing from what he had memorized of the Quran to write down and to document. And so this, it sort of a feeling that we all had, that we are in some ways perhaps responding, right, to Omar's longing to be back home. And given the opportunity for us to travel to the place that he called home so that they could see him again. Dr. Lanisa Kitchener is the chief of the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress, and someone who has become a dear friend. She traveled with us in this most current phase to Senegal in December of 22. And this is again the first time that there is a huge gathering in Omar's honor in Dakar, to really begin to think about how do we explore again this diasporic connection. Who is Omar as an American Muslim? Who is Omar as an African man, right, from Futa? And so just really rich sort of exchange of just again insight, wisdom, gratitude, hospitality, but also this sense of Omar is even, right, so long ago, he is having such a profound influence in the present, bringing these communities, right, that he had been a part of together. And so you see Dr. Lanisa and Sister Teresa and I, by all accounts, the first African-American, certainly women, to visit the village of Coppe, Omar's home village. This is the second oldest mosque in Coppe. Again, the village that through all of the evidence that Dr. Sek and others have gathered assures us with some degree of certainty, given all of the research that has been done, that this is the place where he was born. And this is, again, when we say on the between the two rivers, you can walk to the banks of the Senegal River from the village, and on the other side of the river, the Senegal River, is Mauritania. And so even thinking about the geography, the linguistic evidence, the historical evidence, excuse me, all point to this place. And so here I am with the chief, Chief Ba, who is, again, thinking about the genealogical evidence. He is a descendant of Omar's sister. And so we're thinking now, again, not just about the past, but the living descendants of Omar ibn Said, and their desire, right, to know what we know and then to add to the story that we can now share about who he was. One of our sincere intentions at Muslim Wellness Foundation is to think about the ways that we build over time a relationship with the people of Coppe that honors the hospitality, the kindness, the knowledge, the time that they have given to us in this exploration of the origins of Omar ibn Said. And so our question was, well, in this sort of exchange of knowledge, right, what are some of the needs also that we don't want to, conduct research like colonizers, right, or people who are going to be transactional and just extract from the people, and not offer anything of good, right? And so our question was, how does the village prioritize their needs? What are some concerns that they have? What are resources that are would be important to improving sort of a sense of well-being there as well? And we said, and please ask the women these questions. And, subhanAllah, what we were able, in the summer of 21, we raised about $20,000 on behalf of the Said Institute. And a portion of that money was earmarked towards helping, again, further the research with Dr. Steck, and also to think about, again, if we're going to engage in a long-term partnership, relationship, collaboration, we also want to ensure that they understand that we are also concerned about their well-being, right? And so, as you expect, asking the women gave us some good information. And one of them was that the picture that you see here in the middle is of a millet processing machine that had not worked since 1995, right? And so the picture on the left shows the ways that the women would pound the millet for food, and this took up significant amount of time, right? It's very labor intensive, and so we were able to raise the funds to replace that old machine that hadn't functioned since 1995 with a new one on the right. And so when we arrived in December of 2022, this was a surprise. We had just sort of worked out the details with the chief and a couple of other companions, and we were able to bring, along with the new millet processing machine, medicine, supplies, sort of games, toys for for children, but then also just very basic things like Bengay for the older people, and thinking about what are some of the medicines that we might take for granted but could be really important, again, in terms of thinking about well-being. And so here you see the official welcome of Dr. Mamram, of myself, Dr. Lanisa Kitchener. We traveled as a group to Coppe in the end of December of 22, and it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. The people there, just very sincere, very kind, very honest, just incredible. And so people came from all over, right, to hear more about what we wanted to share of Omar ibn Said, and also our desire for a connection that could last through the years, again, bringing together the communities of American Muslims that Omar was a part of here, and sort of reclaiming the connection that was severed to his village in Senegal. So you see more folks that were there to welcome us. Sister Miriam was someone who, alhamdulillah, that we developed a bond there as well. One of the village elders. The people are beautiful, kind. I just cannot say enough about, again, in terms of the healing that I felt, to be in a space where, honestly, truly, I felt like Islam is everywhere, right? It's in the soil, it's in the air, it's in the way that people remember and dhikr and treat one another. For me, it was the first time being on the continent, and I could not think of a more grounding and nourishing experience than the one that I had in Coppe. And here, what I want to share is after the official welcome and reception in the morning, one of the mornings that we arrived, the people there made dua, right? There's no gathering that will close without, right, supplication. And they they were at first concerned because I started to cry, right? I'm recording, and so I'm trying to be very, very still. And so tears are just flowing down my face because, and I shared with them later, they're like, oh no, Sister Kameelah, like, are you okay? And it was like tears of joy, right? To have been able to be a part of such an extraordinary effort. Again, to seek knowledge from the people, but also to be connected to their concerns and what would well-being mean for them, and then to have and to listen, right, to the ways that they are praying and calling on Allah and remembering the Prophet. Just it just opened up something in my heart, and the tears flowed. So I wanted to play a little bit of that moment. بنا على جنب ثارنا وتالي ودن جميعنا لمجد الميسر ولا تخيب لرجاء ولا طريق وهب لكل ذلك المريد دليلنا المراد بالمزيد واطوي له ويد كل كون واكتب له نظرات الكون حتى إنسانك أنت قد يقين ربي بتا بتا وأطيان رب الماء الغيوب وتبجن كل تاج محبوب كريدا يواتي وركبا ومركبا نجاتي وامدد بالذكر وذكر الاسم وغدي بالزيد يسمي وتكفي مهونة ليالي ما دام في ميدان ذاك الهادي وهب له الدنيا الدنيا واخرى عزة مرضية وافتح له الهي بما يرتجي خير الفتوى يا قريب الفرج وافتح له الهي بما يرتجي خير الفتوى يا قريب الفرج وافتح له الهي بما يرتجي خير الفتوى يا قريب الفرج من فتن المحيا النجوى والممات وحبل قبره والسكرات ونبل التريع وأنتي واتت ورحمه ولا تأي. So this, I'm hoping that just that small sort of clip of the moment is able to sort of capture the spirit of the people, just, you know, extraordinary. And so being able to reconnect with the living descendants of Omar, being able to see how, again, over 200 years later, the spirit of the place that I felt was that Islam is everywhere, right? Islam is here, right? It is part of the air that we breathe. And so now I understand, right, how Omar ibn Said could have survived decades of bondage because of this place, right? Because of spending, you know, just a few days, right, in the place that he called home. For me, it was just absolutely, right, I can understand what this kind of foundation would have provided for him as he looked to his 94th birthday, right, as an enslaved person, right, captured when he was 37 because of this place, right? So for what is important for us, and one of the extraordinary lessons that I learned is that so much of what we think about healing, what we imagine sort of a place of flourishing and thriving and of health to look like, is reconnecting with our histories, of understanding like what has nourished us over time and how do we lift that up? How do we do more of that? And so it is, you know, really been an honor for us at Muslim Wellness Foundation to continue this collaboration with the village of Coppe. And it has resulted in the young people organizing themselves into an association named after Omar ibn Said. We last Ramadan of 23, we raised about approximately $3,000 for the village. And it was the first time, because of those funds, that each family was able to receive provisions that lasted them through Ramadan, so basic like sugar and rice and coffee, and that just those small sort of investments, right? And I hesitate to call it an investment, but really our appreciation for who they are and the connection that they're opening up for us is invaluable, right? And so how do we think about what it means to honor, right? How they're helping us, how they're, you know, reconnecting, right? Or repairing some of what was severed. And it's thinking about, again, what helps with the quality of life. And that is basic provisions, right, to start with. And so there's a brother who is from Coppe that lives in the Chicagoland area. And normally every year, he does what he can to provide resources back home. And so last year we said, you know, brother, we have to do what we can, right, to assist when we see so much of ourselves in this place, and we want to continue, right, to deepen that relationship. And so again, we have been sort of reluctant to um, we want to be very humble about our contributions to this village. And what they have shared with us is that it has been very meaningful to meet someone like me, who is a descendant of enslaved people, who is Muslim, and the questions that they have about slavery, the questions that they have about what could have happened to Omar, requires that we build trust, and that we build community, we build a sense of connection, because it is more than information that is being shared. It's really our experiences, both the challenges and the pain, but also what is possible. And so being able to make a small contribution during Ramadan that would help the entire village and all of the families was just, again, for us, just a small measure of what it means to repair and to reconnect. So I hope in this overview, it provides, again, a sense of what really excites us about this effort, the potential, and what it means for us to heal on both sides of the Atlantic. And so I invite you back to meet Dr. Mu'Min Oseguera. I forgot to, I should have shared the photo. He is such a beloved scholar, Dr. Sek, in the village of Coppe, that when we were there, a child was born just a few days prior to our arrival, and they named him Mamram. And so this is, again, an indication of how much they have just truly embraced this information, Omar as an ancestor who has come back to them, and their appreciation for how we have done that. So Dr. Mamram Sek will be with us on Sunday at 11 Central, and he is, again, an extraordinary researcher, but more than a researcher, he has a tremendous love for the people, and it comes through in how committed he is to ensuring that we learn from them, they learn from us, and that this is a really meaningful and deep relationship. I also want to invite you back for our masterclass, Intro to Black Muslim Psychology, and Nadira Habibullah and Ustad Tabari Zahir will be joining me for that discussion. And you can, of course, I'm going to drop in the chat. You can check out the following link in order to get a full sort of calendar of events that we'll be hosting this month. But this is, again, another sort of exciting conversation that we want to have about what it means for us to think about Black Muslim psychology, not in terms of pathology, but understanding history. What is psychological well-being? How do we consider spirituality and liberation? How do those values then guide our lives? You will also have an opportunity to learn in a learning workshop with Dr. Sek. He will be teaching a 3-week course on Wolof, which is the major language that is spoken in Senegal. And Abdoulaye Gay will be teaching Pular, which is the language of Omar ibn Said, also in a 3-week series. And this will be back to back. So 10 a.m. Central and then 12 p.m. Central. It'll be Pular and then Wolof. And again, both are extraordinary scholars. I would highly recommend. This is the second year the second year that Abdoulaye will be teaching. And he is a certified translator. He's an interpreter. He's a founding member of the Senegalese Association of Translators, and just a wonderful person. Again, the village of Coppe really honor both Abdoulaye and Dr. Sek. And so it would be just really, I think, worth it for all of you to also sit with them. And then finally, February 21st, I will be in conversation with Dr. Samia Rahman and a former DAR member, my Abu, my stepdad, El Haj Ali Muhammad, and talking a little bit more about the Dar al-Islam movement, which is a Sunni African-American Muslim movement in the United States that started in 1962, called the People's Effort. And this oral history project I've been working on for the last 2 years, again, is an act of reclamation, of thinking about how Muslims in America, specifically African-American and Black Muslims, have understood Islam to be a liberating force. And so the communities that are established around that sense of spiritual sovereignty, of autonomy, of wholeness, is also essential to understanding Black Muslim psychology. And last but not least, I want you to save the dates, if you have not already, for BMPC 2024, the Black Muslim Psychology Conference in Chicago, July 20th to the 21st. And the theme for this year is Longing for Home, a place where a soul can rest. And this theme comes out of Muslim Wellness Foundation's year-long exploration of themes related to home and to hijra. So what does it mean to understand migration, exile, forced migration, whether that is from the American South or the global South, right? What does it mean for us to understand how we build places that we can belong, that we can, feel a sense of who we are and of rootedness. And really this exploration is meant to raise questions and also to sort of think together about what it means that to, as Bell Hooks says, have a place where a soul can rest. And she uses the metaphor of a porch, or places where African Americans sort of sought to understand themselves, to have safety, just to gather. And so this longing for home that many of us might feel in different ways for different reasons often influences our sense of well-being, psychological well-being, physical well-being, and we want to explore that together. So I am done. So thank you so much for joining. Definitely, if you can, return to Muslim Wellness Foundation on Sunday at 11 a.m. Central. Dr. Sek will be joining us. And again, he is an extraordinary scholar and one who has such a deep knowledge of Omar ibn Said, and is doing a lot of writing around how do we begin his narrative with the place where he was born rather than the date of his capture. So I invite you back on Sunday at 11 a.m. Central, and definitely check out that link to see all of our activities for the month of February. We're very excited and want you to join us. So with that, I am going to let you get on with the rest of your evening, but thank you for joining. And I'll post this recording to our link tree. It'll be on social media so that you can share it with others. Again, we're just extraordinarily humbled and excited about the depth of the work and what it means for us to really reframe what we think about when we talk about healing. We talk about identity, right? It means expanding our narratives, looking to our histories, that can then inform how we can be well in the present and certainly well into the future. So join us on that journey. I would love to speak with you again, inshallah. But with that, I will bid you good night and assalamu alaikum.